Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to our viewers. In this webinar, I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I will be taking questions from you, the viewers. So please stay with us and please send us your questions. Questions can be sent to dialogues@wto.org. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I will be moderating this session today. I'd like to begin by providing some context for today's webinar entitled The AOA at 25 Teaser for the WTO Agriculture Symposium. The Agreement on Agriculture, known as the AOA for viewers who are not WTO experts, this is part of our jargon and you will be hearing that acronym throughout this session, AOA for the WTO Agreement on Agriculture. That agreement has existed for exactly 25 years today, and we are celebrating its 25-year existence this year. To mark this important occasion, the WTO is organizing a virtual agriculture symposium that will be held from 2 to 3 December this year, to which you are all invited, and in which all sorts of topical issues on agriculture will be addressed. Edwini Kessi, who is the director of the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and who is with us today, will be talking to us about the symposium and walking us through it towards the end of this webinar. So please stay with us. This episode of the Trade Dialogues on Food is intended to act as a teaser, or as an introduction, if you will, to the symposium, setting out some of the regional and WTO Secretariat perspectives on the 25 years of existence of the Agreement on Agriculture. There's no doubt that the past 25 years have seen an incredible transformation in world trade at large, including in trade and agriculture. The transformation has been fueled by the very creation of the WTO, by the entry into force of the WTO rulebook, including the Agreement on Agriculture, and the creation, of course, of a much stronger dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO relative to the GATT. And there have been many other forces at play too in this transformation. These forces have included a revolution in trade logistics and containerized shipping and information technology and more. The infrastructure and operating environment of international trade, if you will, have been transformed over the past 25 years. With us today is a very distinguished panel to discuss the 25 years of the AOA. So let me, without further ado, introduce our distinguished panel to you. Sunanta Kangval Kulkij, Ambassador of Thailand to the WTO. Zolelwa Mlumbi Peter, Ambassador of South Africa to the WTO. Eugenio Diaz Bonilla, Head of Latin America and the Caribbean Program at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. Robert Koopman, Director of the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the WTO. And Edwini Kessi, Director of the Agriculture and Commodities Division of the WTO. So let me now move to the first round of questions. Bob, let me start with you. Can you describe to us what some of the major changes have been in the structure of agricultural trade since the entry into force of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture? What have some of the main trends been? You need to unmute.
Yes, I was trying to. I somehow disappeared, my little unmute button, which I'm always searching for. Although, thank you. And it's my pleasure to share some overview of the changing world of agriculture here in the past 25 years. We've seen pretty significant changes in the geography of agricultural production and trade, as well as the commodity composition. And let me run through some of those for you. So we've seen world exports of ag products more than triple between 1995 and 2019, going from about 446 billion US dollars in 1995 to 1.5 trillion dollars in 2019. And that's about 5.1% growth per year. World imports also increased about the same amount over that period, from 461 billion to 1.48 trillion. And that's 5% per year growth. Now, the geographic distribution has shifted, as I said, quite a bit. In 1995, Europe represented about half of world agricultural exports, but that fell to about 43% in 2019. North America's share also went down. It went down from 18% to 16% during that period. And so did the Middle East's, falling from 1.1% to about 0.9%. The regions whose shares rose were Asia from 16 to 21%, and South and Central America from 9% to 13%, Africa from 3 to 4%, and the Commonwealth of Independent States from 1.1% to 4%. In 2019, the US was the top exporter and importer of agricultural products, and China's share of imports almost quadrupled between 1995 and 2019. Brazil was the top net exporter of agricultural products in 2019, with a surplus of about 72 billion US dollars. Argentina was second. Both were relatively large net exporters in 1995 also, but their net exports have grown significantly during this period. In 2019, we also saw relatively new large net exporters, such as Thailand, Spain, Ukraine, and Poland. China was the top net importer in 2019, whereas in 1995, it was a net exporter. So that's a little bit of an overview of the geography. Now, if we look at the changing product composition, we see pretty significant changes also. Soybeans were the most imported agricultural product in 2019, with about 4.3% of total world agricultural imports. In 1995, soybeans were in 13th place, so they've gone from 13th to first place. Back in 1995, coffee had been the most imported product, and its share was about 3.7%. It fell to 10th place in 2019. The top three products, as I said, have changed quite a bit. We've seen soybeans, food preparations, not elsewhere specified. That share is about 3.2%. And then grape wines and alcohol must, with a share of 2.6%. They make up about 10% of global trade. The top three products in 1995, which were quite different, as I said, it was coffee, wheat and meslin, and then cigars, tobacco products. They also made up about 10% of global trade in 1995. We've also seen changing production models, value chains, for instance. So we see that in 2015, and the data for value chains doesn't go back to 1995, unfortunately, but where we do have data, it tells a very interesting story. So what we see in 2015 is about 61% of value added in world exports of agricultural products originated within agriculture itself, while 39% were sourced from other industries located upstream in the production chain. The service industry accounted for about 23% of value added, mainly from distribution and business services, and another 12% came from manufacturing industry. And what we've seen over time, and I'll talk about this with my next intervention, is a significant growth in the role of services embedded in agricultural trade. Doa, I'll stop there, and thanks for the opportunity to give that overview.
Thank you very much. So obviously some very significant changes here, whether in terms of the players, who the main actors are, the size of the trade, and the composition of the trade. Eugenio, let me move to you. What are some of the main forces of transformation in agricultural trade? What have these been over the past 25 years? Could you walk us through what you consider to be the principal drivers of change, as well as briefly comment, of course, given your expertise, on the Latin America and Caribbean experience with the AOA?
Thank you very much, Doa. Thanks, WTO, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in this distinguished panel. This year we are, so congratulations WTO also for the 25th year. This year we are also celebrating United Nations, FAO, IMF and World Bank. They started in 44, but the IMF was started specifically in 45. So it's also 75 years for IMF. So, and this is just to remind us the importance of the international organization, the coordination that we need, and the collective action that we need at the global level. In particular, coming from Latin America, it's and to my colleagues in Latin America, to remember that the Latin American countries were about a third in all these initial signatory countries. And this is, I think, is important to remember in this moment that Latin America is in the middle of a social, economic, health, and political crisis, and that we need to work together as we did in the 40s when these institutions were created. And in 1994-95, I was at the embassy. I was a diplomat at the embassy of Argentina, my country, in Washington. I was in charge of the agricultural sector, so I was very much involved in the negotiations to start the WTO. So I like to remember and celebrating the memory of a colleague, a dear colleague that is now with us, Nestor Stancanelli, who was the chief negotiator. So going back to your points, the drivers, we need to consider trends and cycles. So since 1990, in terms of cycles, we went through commodity cycles related in part, the last one started in the mid 2000s, and then around the 2008, 2005, if you remember, we have that big jump in prices. Now prices are high, but the underlying trends, I think we need to consider mostly population. Since the WTO was created, the world has 2 billion more people. Also, income per capita increased from 7,400 to about 11,000 right now. It's almost 50% increase. So that means that the GDP is far bigger. The developing countries in general, developing and emerging, increase significantly the share of the GDP. If you measure at exchange rate, market exchange rate, move from 35 to around 40. But at the same time, we were able, notwithstanding all these new people, we were able to increase calories per capita about 10%, the supply, and proteins 14%, with only increasing 2% the land. And that was mostly because of technological change. The TFP, the total factor productivity, increased almost 40%. The poverty diminished, so the main issues were poverty and undernourishment. It was 53% poverty at the world level in 1995. We are at 25 now, if we counted at $3.2. So the main problems at that time are very different now. We have of the three burdens of malnutrition, we have more problems of obesity, leading to non-communicable diseases and lack of minerals and vitamins and main nutrients. So the world changed, and it also changed the underlying technology in energy, which was relevant for the WTO, because we went through first biofuels that had a big impact in prices of agricultural products, but at the same time we had the shale revolution, gas and oil, and now we are seeing a huge change in technology in renewables they are going to change completely the landscape. And that was also related to climate change. Climate change at that time was not a main issue. We had only the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In 1995, it was the second report, and now it's far more clear the impact of climate change, that also agriculture is part of the change, but also is affected by the change. And at the same time, there was a big increase in urbanization, which changed basically all the value chain. So all those changes are driving agriculture in that period. And I'm finishing with this. Latin America moved transformed, as Robert mentioned before, the main net exporting region for agriculture and for food. If you put together US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and depending on the definitions, even European Union, Latin America is a bigger export. So it's key for food security at the world level. And at the same time, Latin America is the main provider of international public goods in terms of carbon sinks. 36% of is in the biomass in Latin America of carbon, the cycle of water, the cycle of oxygen, and biodiversity. And at this moment, COVID is, Latin America is the center of the pandemic. And therefore, whatever happens in Latin America, we need a big investment in technology. And of course, first to solve the health crisis, that will have great implications for agricultural at the global level. So I'll stop there, and then I may go further to the next question.
Thank you very much, Eugenio. That was very comprehensive. So indeed, lots of factors at play, from population growth to rise in per capita income, the emerging developing countries, and the much more significant role that they're playing now, and so on. Ambassador Sunanta, let me turn to you. Can you describe how Thailand has seen its agricultural trade evolve over the past 25 years of the AOA? And could you briefly also touch on Asia's experience more generally with this agreement?
Okay, thank you very much, Doa. And I would like to start by expressing my appreciation to the WTO and also the Agriculture and Commodity Division, especially FNE, for organizing this event. As one of the world's top agriculture exporters, Thailand has always been a strong supporter of the set of trade rules that is fair and market orientation. And in this regard, 25 years ago, the WTO set a milestone when we witnessed the historical agreement on agriculture. And this year we celebrate its 25th anniversary. So congratulations. And now regarding your question, I have to say that before 1995, the agricultural sector was a major contributor to our GDP and economy due to the historical comparative advantage in the sector, such as abundant land, low labor costs, and public comparative advantages in the sector. So therefore, at the inception of the AOA in 1995, Thailand was already one of the world's top agricultural exporter. So during 1995 and 2019, Thailand's agriculture total trade increased at high rates, more than 4 times, from approximately 10 billion to over 47 billion US dollar. And Thailand also increased its trade surplus by the 14.9 billion US dollar from 3.9 billion US dollar in 1995 to 18.8 billion US dollar in 2019, making it a top 10 next exporter last year. So for exports of traditional crops, such as rice and cassava, remain robust and continue to be some of the most important exports for the past few decades. At the same time, the production growth of some crops, such as cotton, soybean, and garlic, has steadily declined due to more importance of importation of such products from competitive sources. So in the past 25 years, Thailand has also shifted to produce more of processed agricultural products, such as canned pineapple and processed chicken, in an attempt to produce higher value products. In recent years, Thailand has also invested a lot in R&D and developed rice into products with premium market values and greater varieties, such as functional food, cosmetics, and skincare products. So the example of Thailand agricultural products evolution are the result of the challenges in the global trade environment. I think that Bob already touched on the global value chain integration. And I think that in the case of Thailand, we also see a lot of benefit from global value chain integration. And for Thailand, from the statistic that I have, for foreign value added in agricultural sector was approximately 12% or $73 million in 2015. So it can be seen that from Thailand's experience that the AOA can enhance and promote members' roles in global agricultural trade and exports, imports, and also participation in the global value chain. So I believe that the AOA is a significant backbone and also the catalyst for agricultural trade. And now turning to the Asia experience with the AOA, I think that thanks to Bob, he's already also mentioned about Asia. And looking at the trend more generally, Asia saw positive trends in the world agricultural trade between 1995 to 2019, where Asia's shares grew from 19% to 24%. And we have seen China exports grew almost 5-folds, and imports grew at incredible 14-folds from 2000 to 2019, becoming the 4th largest exporters and a 3rd largest importer of the agricultural products. And India, who was not previously a top 10 exporter or importer, has moved into the top 10 for both categories in 2019, and with growth over 5 times and 10 times in exports and exports, respectively. So for LDC, with comparative advantage in agricultural products, such as Cambodia, also has strong growth in agricultural exports, recording remarkable growth of 74-folds from the accession in 2004 to 2019. And also Vietnam acceded to the WTO in 2007, also seen agricultural exports grew by 4 times from prior to accession to 2019, and are considered a strong agricultural exporter. So in general, I still believe that there are more opportunity for an expansion of agricultural trade within the region and globally. But Doha, let me also point it out at this stage that from the statistics that I have some kind of research, it seems that most of the WTO members having regional trade agreements are in Asia. And considering that most, if not all, of these RTA also contain commitments in agricultural products, which have the main objective of reducing or eliminating tariffs among participating parties. Therefore, Asia agricultural trade may have also been benefited from an increasing number of regional trade agreements. But since all RTAs are based on the WTO agreement, including agriculture, so I believe that more or less the AOA has played a vital role in helping gear the agriculture trade directly and indirectly towards more market orientation and enable general agricultural trade performance to be enhanced by setting a set of clear rules and also for all members with a view to achieving fairer and freer agricultural trade. So I think that I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sunanda. Indeed, very encouraging to hear how Thailand has risen to become one of the world's major agricultural exporters over the lifetime of the AOA. and all the opportunities that have been created by the AOA, including for least developed countries in Asia, who, as you have mentioned, have also seen their share of international trade expand, such as Cambodia and Vietnam since its accession. Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. Ambassador Zoleilwa, can I turn to you? Could you describe to us how South Africa has seen its agricultural trade evolve over the past 25 years of the AOA? And could you briefly touch on Africa's experience with this agreement more generally?
Thank you very much, Doa, for giving me the floor, and greetings to all. And congratulations to the WTO on marking the 25 years of the Agreement on Agriculture. Coming to your question, our experience over the past 25 years demonstrates a South African economy, including in relation to agriculture, that is increasingly integrated in world markets, with about 1/3 of agricultural production exported. South Africa is thus among the world's leading exporters of agro-food products such as wine, fresh fruits, and sugar. Total trade has also increased from 1996 from 18.8 billion rands to 232 billion rands in 2019. Agriculture is therefore very important to the South African economy from an employment, food security, and trade point of view. The sector employs approximately 880,000 people across the value chain. As you can see from the figures that I've just mentioned, agricultural trade shows healthy growth. And since 1996, the relative importance of agricultural exports has grown from 9.7% of total exports to 11% in 2019. With regards to imports, the percentage of agriculture has remained at around 7% over the years. Therefore, the WTO, without a doubt, and the associated benefits of transparency and predictability in trade has contributed to this growth. However, it is important to note that agriculture's contribution to GDP has declined from 3.9% in 1995 to approximately 2.4% in 2018. Chair, South Africa was an active participant in the Uruguay round of negotiations as a founding member of the GATT. And under the round, we took commitments of a developed member because of policies of the apartheid regime that notified us at that time as a developed country. And this has contributed in reducing some of our policy space in terms of leveraging tariffs as an important policy tool for economic development. It is also important to note that at the onset of our democracy in 1994, we implemented major reforms that resulted in unilateral tariff liberalization as well. Hence, the tariff cuts that we implemented were substantially higher than that was required under the Uruguay round. Importantly, we also phased out the aggregate measurement of support, what is called the AMS, as well as export subsidies for all practical purposes in early 2000s. So South Africa is therefore a fairly open economy with low applied tariffs in agriculture that are not overly complex. At the bound level, 215 lines are bound at zero with an average bound rate of 39%. At the MFN level, 455 lines are at zero with a simple average tariff of 8.6%. And all our bound rates are at ad valorem tariffs. Over the last 25 years, Chair, we have seen major shifts, We have seen major shifts in agricultural trade. And we saw the growth of importance of the SADC region as an export destination. In 1996, the EU was our major export destination at 34% of total exports, while SADC was at 20%. But in 2019, 36% of our exports are destined now for the SADC region, while the EU has reduced to 24%. And we expect this trend to continue, especially with the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And if I move to the African continent, Africa's contribution in global trade in agriculture was 3.5% in 2001 and increased to about 4% as indicated by Bob in 2019. So for South Africa and Africa, the agreement on agriculture was a great achievement 25 years ago. What is important going forward is to ensure that the agreement effectively promotes, as envisaged in the preamble of the Agreement on Agriculture, the establishment of a fair and market-oriented agricultural trading system. It is also important that we correct and prevent restrictions and distortions in world agricultural markets. And without a doubt, the agreement provides a very good framework and a first step towards fair competition and a less distorted sector. However, our view is that real reform is needed urgently, as called for immediately after the Uruguay round and as entailed in Article 20 of the agreement. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think it's fascinating probably for our viewers to hear about your experience in unilateral trade liberalization and how you've exceeded what was called for by the Uruguay round. And I'm sure our viewers will have questions on that. In fact, questions are already rolling in. So thank you for that. Edwini, let me turn to you. We've now heard from the stakeholders of the WTO from Latin America, Asia, Africa. We'd now like to hear from you, from the WTO Secretariat, your point of view on the progress you have seen from inside the WTO and how the organization manages agricultural trade. What can you tell us about the progress that the organization has made internally over the past 25 years, whether in terms of its negotiating function or trade monitoring function?
Thank you, Doa, for this question. And also, I'd like to thank the other panelists, for extending their congratulations on the WTO celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Agreement on Agriculture. As we all know, agriculture is very important. We have heard from other panelists that although the share of agriculture is going down, but notwithstanding that, we see that agriculture is a key driver of the multilateral trading system. A lot of countries, particularly least developed countries and African countries, depend on agriculture. The share of agriculture to the GDP of most LDCs and African countries is quite significant. And I think this is one of the reasons why the WTO as an institution attaches a lot of importance to the agricultural sector. Now, we all know that the role of the WTO in the management of world trade is crucial, especially in the current environment. I think there is agreement that we need more trade in order to enable the global economy to recover quickly from the recession which has been induced by the pandemic. It is important to remember that the WTO is the only international organization with a mandate to manage the international trading system. It has 164 members ranging from developing to least developed countries. Prior to the WTO, agricultural trade was governed by the GATT, which had a number of shortcomings. In fact, when it came to agriculture, the GATT disciplines on agriculture were quite weak, and that led to the belief that the GATT didn't cover agriculture, but that view is erroneous. The GATT covered agriculture, except that the disciplines were quite weak. But as compared to manufactured products, the disciplines were far weak, and that's why there is the view that that GATT didn't cover agriculture, but it did, as I've mentioned. Now, with the weak disciplines and the unpredictable nature of agricultural trade, a key objective of countries during the Uruguay round was to try to have a very firm, robust, and a secure and predictable environment. And this is quite important if you consider the fact that internationally, or international trade feeds 1 in every 6 people. So if you have a situation where trade in agriculture is very uncertain, then it is not an optimal situation that one can find him or herself in. One of the key achievements of the Uruguay round was the tariffication process, which I think many of our viewers would have heard, where, basically under Article 4.2 of the Agreement on Agriculture, all WTO members were required to convert all non-tariff barriers into tariffs. And that actually resulted in a much more secure environment. Because before then, countries had variable levies, import ban, and other measures, which actually made trade in agriculture very unpredictable as compared to manufactured products. So the tariffication process enhanced transparency and provided security and predictability to farmers, agribusinesses, and other stakeholders. Likewise, world agricultural subsidy levels were sky high, with a limited leveling of the playing field in international markets. These subsidies resulted in the crowding out of agricultural exports of many developing countries, particularly those in Africa, who would have otherwise been competitive in international markets. The Agreement on Agriculture brought about an orderly classification of agricultural subsidies based on their degree of trade distortion. Harmful subsidies were reduced and good subsidies were allowed to persist, like environmental subsidies, which countries can provide under the green box. Under the green box, countries are allowed to pursue food security, regional development, environmental policy, and other objectives. So that's why we refer to them as good subsidies. The agreement also recognized the special challenges faced by developing countries by giving them policy space in terms of enabling them to adopt certain policies which developed countries couldn't do. So for example, under Article 6.2 of the Agreement on Agriculture, developing countries are allowed to provide investment and input subsidies to resource-poor farmers, low-income and resource-poor farmers. We have also seen another huge development in terms of the commitment by WTO members to eliminate all forms of export subsidies in Nairobi in 2015. So clearly, we have seen that the Agreement on Agriculture has been a force for good. It has resulted in a stronger and a fairer-based WTO, which has provided opportunities for developing countries in particular. We must also remember that the Agreement on Agriculture is not the only WTO agreement which has impacted positively on trade in agriculture. We also have the Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, which also celebrates 25 this year. So we do have a number of important agreements which obviously they were given birth to at the same time. So we also need to remember the contribution which is being made by the SPS agreement to trade in agriculture. The SPS agreement recognizes the right of countries to impose measures to protect human, animal, plant life, and health. But it also insists that standards applied must be science-based, non-discriminatory, and shouldn't be more restrictive than necessary. So it has basically also contributed in a great measure to the security and predictability of trade in agricultural products. We can also see the contribution of an agreement such as trade in services, which has also given boost to agricultural trade. Without logistics and others, it would be very difficult. We find that a country like Egypt is one of the top producers of fruits and vegetables. However, because of logistics, Egypt hasn't actually realized its full potential, mainly because of the weak services infrastructure. So there are so many WTO agreements which are relevant to agricultural trade. So we shouldn't only focus on the Agreement on Agriculture, but as well, we also need to focus on other agreements. The Trade Facilitation Agreement is also one of them. In fact, from 1995 to today, we have seen that the share of developing countries in world trade has actually increased. We heard from Sunata, we heard from Bob, how we have seen that Asia now accounts for almost 20% of all agricultural exports, South and Central America 13%, and Africa 4%. However, there is more to be done. WTO members recognize this. There was this inbuilt provision in Article 20 that we should have further negotiations on agriculture. Members do realize that the commitments they assumed back in 1995 were not adequate, and obviously 25 years have lapsed. And so we do still have some work to do in order to level the playing field to ensure that we remove distortions. The negotiations, as we all know, have been very slow. I think Doa mentioned and other colleagues have also mentioned. So there is the temptation to give up on the agricultural negotiations, especially in this day and age when we see a massive proliferation of bilateral and regional trade agreements. But we have also seen, as Sunanta mentioned, most of these agreements have focused mostly on market access. None of them has actually focused on the topical issue of agricultural subsidies. In fact, most, if not all agreements do not tackle this issue, including the recently concluded RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which barely dealt with agriculture. So it is important. The WTO has to be strengthened so that the WTO can continue its work of disciplined domestic support. We have seen several studies done by the Keynes group of countries have shown that current entitlements of countries, if not restrained, will soon exceed $2 trillion, not a trillion. Initially, we were saying $1 trillion, but it can exceed 2 trillion. So it is important for the WTO to continue its work on disciplining that, because market access shouldn't depend on how deep the pockets of a government is, but rather on how the farmers are competitive. So there is more to be done to ensure a level playing field. And I think the WTO members are quite committed to ensuring disciplining domestic support. Now, let me also touch on one issue, which is the WTO's monitoring role, which is very, very important. In the WTO Committee on Agriculture, the regular committee, for example, and also the SPS committee, members regularly discuss new trade policy developments. They debate and even challenge each other's trade policies. This exercise in transparency and international accountability is key to orderly trade relations and ensuring that the AOA is able to achieve its full potential. In summary, Doa, I would like to say that the WTO plays a crucial role in agricultural trade, and it should be strengthened to enable it to continue making a vital contribution in making food accessible to all and enhancing global food security. So I'll just stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edwini. That was a tour de force, as we say in French. Very good overview of what the WTO has accomplished in the field of agriculture. Thank you for reminding us of the centrality of the WTO and the multilateral trading system to agricultural trade, and in particular of the fact that, as you mentioned, regional trade agreements do not address some of the most difficult issues which we in the WTO try to tackle. Let me now start our second round of questions. Bob, I'll start with you once again. Relative to other sectors of world trade, such as industrial goods and such as services, how has agricultural trade compared over the past 25 years? What are some of the similarities and differences that you would point to? And if you could just briefly touch on how ag trade has been affected by COVID-19, I think our viewers would really appreciate that.
Thanks, Doa. So I'll have less data in this presentation and sort of more overview kinds of insights, but some data to start with. The share of agricultural products in total merchandise exports fell a little bit, from 8.9% in 1995 to 7.9% in 2019. And the decline is really the result of rapid growth in non-agricultural product trade during this period. From 1995 to 2005 was a period of very, very rapid globalization, where trade grew more than twice as fast as GDP. And while agriculture and merchandise trade definitely benefited from this growth, so has trade and services, as has been pointed out, both embedded in the supply chains, but also just cross-border services trade generally. Now, the period was unique. Not only did we have the Uruguay round, but we also had the opening up and liberalization of China, the former European planned economies, and India, that along with a growing number of large and deep regional preferential trade agreements, which have been mentioned already, contributed to this burst of growth of trade that had not really been seen except one other period that in history prior to the first round of globalization prior to World War I. So the fact that the opening up of a number of former European planned economies in China, they played a major role in driving trade growth and in the changing composition of agricultural importers and exporters. And let me admit here that the first 15 years of my career were working in agricultural trade for a part of the US Department of Agriculture called the Economic Research Service. And part of my job back then was to look at the future of agricultural trade growth and advise US policymakers. I also played a role in the Uruguay round negotiations, which was very interesting. And I remember us economists telling USDA policy advisors that the global landscape for trade was changing, that we saw increased competition from South America. We saw rapid growth in demand in Asia. And believe it or not, these former European centrally planned economies that were big importers, particularly of grains, were likely to become big net exporters. And by the way, policymakers in USDA were like, oh, thank you very much. You know, that sounds very academic. But it turned out that most of these forces were foreseeable and actually have played out. So I think it's important, as Edwini was saying a few minutes ago, that we think about the future of trade, the future of agricultural trade, and what steps can members take to help create this more level playing field, more competitive playing field for all players, as well as help with sustainable development. And I transition on this point to COVID-19 and what it potentially means for agricultural trade. One of the interesting things about COVID-19 is that agricultural trade's been relatively resilient. And so we've seen a little bit of disruption in ag trade, mainly from health-related measures and some temporary trade restrictive measures imposed by some governments. But generally, the data suggests that agricultural trade's done reasonably well, and it's helped to ensure that agriculture and food products have continued to flow to the regions and populations that need them. Now, there are still some supply chain challenges, both internationally and domestically, but thus far, aggregate supplies have been sufficient. And what we do need to do is make sure that agricultural supplies and those supply chain, the smoothness of supply chain deliveries cross-border and domestically will continue through the second round as we see climbing infections in this fall-winter period. But the big challenge, I think, that's going to come from COVID-19 is government intervention. And we see government intervention rising pretty significantly across the board as governments take necessary steps to support their domestic economies. And some of that support is going to the agricultural sector. And that very well could lead, because once you put that support in place, it's often very hard to withdraw it. So something that I think policymakers are going to have to pay attention to, and WTO negotiators, is what is this going to mean for agricultural trade post-COVID into the next 5 to 10 years? I suspect we're likely to see some hangover effects as a result of that. I think I'll stop there, and happy to take any questions at the end of the session. Thanks, Doa.
Thank you very much, Bob. And indeed, as you rightly pointed out, we seem to be entering the era of increased government intervention. So this is the COVID era, and let's see how the AOA will weather that change.
Doa, could I make one more intervention? I forgot to mention. Yeah, I forgot to mention, if you're very interested in COVID and the impacts on agriculture and, say, SPS or regulatory environment, or trade in general, I recommend you go to the WTO website, www.wto.org, and search on COVID-19. We've got a page full of information notes that I think many of you will find very helpful. Thank you, Doa. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that. Eugenio, I'm going to ask you a very unfair question now. The aim of the session has been to look back at the past 25 years of the AOA. But of course, in looking back, we must also keep our eyes on the future. So what can you tell us about the next 25 years? You've spoken to us about the drivers in the past 25 years. Looking forward, what will the drivers be of change in agricultural trade?
Thank you, Doa. I divide in two blocks. One is during and immediately after the pandemic, and then post-pandemic, if you want. During the pandemic, I think the WTO is performing a crucial role with the transparency meetings and what the countries are doing related to COVID. That's great. The work that the OECD, FAO, IICA, and we ourselves at IFPRI are doing, tracking the disruptions in not only in product specific value chains, but also in the case of IFPRI, looking at the whole food system. The problem is that some of this tracking is done separately, A, and B, doesn't cover the whole food system. There are a lot of disruptions that are happening in transportation, in restaurants, in supermarkets. That's affecting the trade, but it's not trade or trade-related policies in the sense of WTO. So first, we need to have a holistic view. Second point related to the pandemic. We have a trade model that it's been now including features of epidemiological impacts. What we are seeing is, yeah, this year, agriculture was far more resilient compared to industry and services, but we are not clear if agriculture is not going to be the problem next year, to 2021, because the production this year was predetermined, if you want, by the previous year, but now the constraints or the problems that we're having now may be affecting 2021. So these two comments I would like to make related to the pandemic. If we go further down the road in terms of years, population is not going to grow at the same level, and it's going to be older. So that changes the diet. So we need to be more careful about the diet. We've been too focused on energy and so on and so forth. We need to be very much diversified. All this discussion about special products and so on and so forth that are basically energy products it's too much 1990s. We need to think differently. Growth is also going to be lower. It's been lower since 2008, 2009 because of the accumulation of debt. Now we are going to accumulate even more debt, and we are having a liquidity overhang in the world economy. The expansion of money, everybody's printing money. That's going to change the growth pattern, but also how we resolve that. Maybe a flare up of inflation. We will need debt restructuring, maybe keeping interest rates depressed. So that's my second point related to growth. It's going to be a slower growth, and we will have to resolve these fiscal and monetary overhangs. My third point is, as probably we've been following the Lancet diet, that basically look at the diets that fit within the environmental constraints and the nutrition constraints. First point, we don't have a lot of information yet related to exactly how the environmental constraints or the nutrition constraints work out, but we need to consider both. But also we need to consider employment constraints. If you put the whole food system, not agriculture primary, the whole food system, transportation, retail, restaurants, tourism, related to risk, that may be about half of employment at the world level. And so we are talking about a food system that need to be more inclusive, resilient, sustainable, with healthy diets and so on and so forth. And certainly the pandemic is showing the importance of resilience in the sense of health resilience. Then we will need a strong restructuring of the whole food system, and that will require a lot of thinking in a holistic way and also investment resources. My two final points. So I mentioned, I'm going to my fourth point, which is technology. Technology is changing in energy, but it's also changing in genetics, imaging, big data. We have what it's called the third revolution of biology. That's very crucial for the WTO because we need to avoid constraints. So we need to develop those technologies. B, we need to protect the investors, but C, we need to make sure that the poor people have access to these technologies. And that's crucial, the SPS, the DBT, as Edwini was mentioned, but also TRIPS. So crucial how these three agreements work in terms of the possibility of developing all the technologies that we need if we want to get out of the nutrition and environmental problems that we have right now. And I close with this. In the negotiations, WTO and a lot of the countries have been very much focused on crops, on production. We need to focus on people. And so all this issue of special products and so on, I think they miss the point. The thing is how we make sure that small farmers and poor farmers, and remember, 84% of the farms at the world level are less than 2 hectares. So they are producers, but they are also consumers. So we need to focus on them. And the instrument that it seems to be helping more are these cash transfers for poverty reasons, but that include productive components. So how that fits within the framework of the WTO, I think is something that we need to make sure that this instrument can be used. We need also to have a focus on the whole food system, not only on the primary product or the disciplines that we have in the agreement on agriculture. We need better categories of countries. Developed and developing are too simplistic. We have systemic countries. IMF is having this idea of systemic countries that may be developed or developing, but they have global impact. So we need to think about what these sort of categories. And finally, we need to, as the countries need to recognize, in all the negotiations, the negotiators always want to have the greatest policy space for your own country and reduce the policy space for other countries. That cannot work. That is the point that Kissinger was making in his work on A World Restored. His thesis for PhD was the first book he produced. If a country wants to have full security, means that all the rest of the countries are totally insecure. If you want to have a lot of policy space, then other countries will not have policy space because there's going to be spillover. So that's basically the most important thing that we need to work on is make sure that to have an international trade system that is based on rule and is respected. And so I finish congratulating again WTO.
Thank you very much, Eugenio. Thank you for putting the emphasis on planetary boundaries. In the next 25 years, that will be a major issue as we look at food systems and our diets and the many sustainability issues that surround our food production. Ambassador Sunanta, let me turn to you. Again, with an eye to the next 25 years, what would Thailand like to see in terms of the evolution of the AOA? What would Thailand's priorities be? And could you briefly comment on the priorities of the developing world as well?
Okay, thank you very much, Dora. First of all, I'd like to say that I totally agree with what Evie mentioned, and also the Professor Eugenio mentioned about we have to see things in a holistic manner. And I think that is very important. And sometimes we tend to lose sight of that. And that's why in my earlier presentation, I mentioned about we have some kind of research to develop rice into premium product. It means that we would like to see how we turn our staple food to serve the aging society, because now Thailand is already entering the aging society, and we would like to see that also, because this is also important to us on the nutrition. And I thank you very much for raising this question. And coming back to your question, Doa, well, I don't want to say that I have to be straightforward, that I would love to see the AOA achieve what it says to do. That is to create the free and fair and transparent and predictable global agricultural trade within the next 25 years. Probably you heard about it a lot, but I think that this is the most important thing that we would like to see in agriculture. And we already succeeded in the elimination of export subsidy, but I think that there's still more we have to do. And the other two pillars on domestic support and market access is also very important. And we have been negotiating on this issue since the Uruguay round, and it seems that we still need to continue our efforts. And for the domestic support, I think that it is already widely acknowledged that the discipline on the domestic support are imbalanced, and also the entitlement has not been adequately kept for long term, and that main issue remain also in the market access, such as the tariff barriers, tariff peaks, tariff escalation, and preference erosions, to name a few. So at this juncture, I have to say that our priority is on the domestic support, as they have the effect of lowering the cost of production, increasing the output, and making export artificially competitive. And it is thus a harmful measure that can prevent or impede another country's progress towards sustainability for its domestic production. And I think that Professor Eugenio also mentioned that this kind of policy space also harmful to the others. And so with the domestic support entitlement has not been adequately reduced or kept for the long term, this means that the majority of trade and production distorting subsidies remain available and still increase in some cases. And Ebony already pointed out that probably may reach the $2 trillion US. So that is the very significant number that we have to think about. So in this regard, for Thailand, we are of the view that new disciplines that would effectively cap and reduce domestic support in an appropriate manner are needed as soon as possible. And for your question regarding the priority for the developing countries in general, I would like to first mention critical short-term priority. That is, it is crucial for members not to implement export restrictions or prohibitions for food purchase for humanitarian and non-commercial purposes. And for the long-term context, I believe that the impact from the COVID-19 pandemic has shown the vulnerability of many developing countries with regard to food security. There are also widespread concerns regarding large stimulus packages that are being rolled out by large countries and the impact this could have on the food security of others. So I would like to say that priority for developing countries would be to establish a level playing field. With performance is not a reflection of huge and harmful subsidies, but countries' factors of endowment and comparative advantage. So this will enable farmers and producers in developing countries to have better livelihood, participate more in global agricultural trade, and address food security concern in the most sustainable manner. To conclude, I think that it must be stressed that trade and production distorting supports are not the only protective means, but also an attacking instrument that can harm food security of others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sunanta. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, we've made uneven progress across the different pillars of the Agreement on Agriculture. We've had incredible success with the export competition pillar, but there's a long way to go still on some of the other pillars, and in particular domestic support, as you've pointed out. Ambassador Zolelwa, let me turn to you. In what direction would South Africa like to see the WTO AOA evolve over the next 25 years? And again, could you also comment on the views of the developing world more generally and their needs in this regard?
Thank you very much, Doha. I can agree with the some of the panelists that have spoken before me, that really what is very important is that we achieve what we set out to achieve in the Agreement on Agriculture, because it's clear in the preamble what the objectives were. But let me respond by saying we remain firm in our belief that the progress in the agricultural negotiations can provide the much needed stimulus to economic recovery and growth, as well as to employment, food security, and broadly the achievement of sustainable development goals, especially SDG 1 and 2 on ending poverty, as well as achieving zero hunger. We're talking in the context of COVID-19. What is clear to us is that it is putting into sharp focus the need to build a more inclusive, balanced, and resilient multilateral trading system, which means that we need to accelerate transformation in the food and agricultural sector so that we build its resilience in the face of a range of challenges, including climate change. An UNCTAD publication on COVID-19, which reads or is titled A Threat to Food Security in Africa, states that from 2016 to 2018, Africa imported about 85% of its food from outside the continent, leading to an annual food import bill of $35 billion US, which is forecast to reach $110 billion US by 2025. This is really unsustainable, and Africa needs to focus on ramping up production. With 60% of arable land, Africa should be the bread basket of the world. The existing trade distortions that Sunanta has referred to, and the rising non-tariff barriers that Edwini referred to, including now the use of SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, is a cause for concern, because, as Edwini said, what is agreed to in the SPS agreement is, of course, everyone is allowed to protect their market, but the measures that are implemented must be scientifically based. But increasingly now we see the use of non-scientifically based sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which affect the ability of African countries to access export markets. Our view is therefore that, in line with what is envisaged in Article 20 of the Agreement on Agriculture, we must reform and make progress in the domestic support pillar as a priority for the agricultural negotiations. The distortions, as Sunanta has rightly indicated, are harming our agricultural sector and unfairly affect our competitiveness as developing countries. We believe that an approach that seeks to cap and substantially reduce the entitlements will be a good departure point, as Edwini has indicated, because what we don't want to see is an increase in beyond the 2 trillion, or even because already the 2 trillion is having a negative impact on our agricultural sector. So we really need to find a way of capping and also substantially reducing those entitlements. The outcome must also provide a solution to the problem of concentration of subsidies. Edwini also referred to the importance of Article 6.2 by developing countries. Our view is that whatever reform we're talking about must preserve the policy space to address the developmental needs specific to agriculture and rural development, and ensure that Article 6.2, which provides the much needed policy space to support resource-poor farmers, is definitely safeguarded. This is critical to the commercialization of the sector and rural development, especially the African context, where you have a small number of commercial operations and large numbers of subsistence farmers. So developing countries need to provide that needed support to resource-poor farmers. It's important that we also, as part of the reform, address the historical imbalances to ensure that those members that are responsible for the major distortions make a bigger contribution to the reduction in trade distorting support. In addition, we need to make progress on mandated issues, which we have all clearly identified. One, especially in the context of COVID-19 and food security, is making progress on public stockholding for food security purposes, as well as a food security agenda given the effects of the pandemic. And this can include also what role the WTO can play in supporting the World Food Programme. Also important is a special safeguard mechanism that has been negotiated, but we are unable to make progress. And it must address volatility of agricultural trade, both in quantities as well as prices, and must result in an appropriate price and volume trigger. The issue of cotton, especially for the cotton 4, which is Burkina Faso, Benin, Chad, and Mali, we really need to make progress. This is a long overdue development issue. Importantly, Chair, is special and differential treatment must always be part of an outcome in the agricultural negotiation. So in conclusion, I think really, as Sunanta has said, the objectives of the agreement on agriculture are very clear and remain as relevant as they were when they were negotiated 25 years ago. So what South Africa and Africa need are fair terms of trade. And this is critical to sustainable development so that we can achieve our potential and produce what we consume and effectively participate in global trade. COVID-19 has exposed the strategic vulnerabilities of being mere producers and exporters of primary products. The critical priority for us is to move up the value chain, and COVID-19 has clearly demonstrated the need for the WTO to support production-led growth, jobs, and structural transformation. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive future-looking agenda. And as our viewers can see, the negotiations are complex and there are many different dimensions to them. Edwini, let me come to you. I want to put two questions to you. First, I'd like you on this webinar to be the voice for a second for the least developed and net food importing countries. What can you tell us about their priorities under the AOA? And second, could you say a few words about the WTO Agriculture Symposium of 2 to 3 December this year and what our viewers can expect?
Thank you, Doa. As we all know, the WTO broadly recognizes 3 groups of countries. So we have, on the one hand, developed countries, developing and least developed countries. Not to mention that this has become a very critical issue for some members. And as Eugenio had alluded to, maybe we are focusing on the wrong things in the WTO in terms of the classification of countries. But clearly, it is a very difficult issue going forward, and which the WTO members would have to address one way or the other. But for the sake of the agricultural negotiations, we do have these 3 classes. For the least developed countries, I think there is the recognition that their economies are very fragile. And so during the Uruguay round, least developed countries were, for example, exempted from reduction commitments. It would appear that although in the current round of negotiations, we haven't actually dealt with market access, but it would appear that a lot of members may accept to exempt LDCs from reduction commitments. Having said that, I think LDCs have a lot of offensive interest in the negotiations. As Skolowa mentioned, in the area of cotton, for example, they are pushing for, because it was agreed in 2005 that for cotton domestic support, we needed an outcome which would be more ambitious, expeditious, and specific to cotton. So as far as trade domestic support is concerned, LDCs have a greater interest in that, because obviously the greater the amount countries provide to support their farmers, invariably it hurts their farmers. So it is an issue of importance for LDCs, trying to get rid or to try to discipline domestic support. On the market access front, to least developed countries would like to see progress on issues such as tariff escalation, because obviously most LDCs and African countries export primary products. But if we were to discipline tariff escalation or to reduce tariff peaks, it would enable them to add value to their raw materials, in which case they can earn more foreign exchange and use it to fund health and other social programs. So market access is also important for LDCs. They want to move up the product value chain rather than just exporting the raw products. On the defensive side, for example, as I mentioned, they would like to be exempted from reduction commitments, and they also like to have an SSM, basically to help them to deal with import surges and price fluctuations. They also want to see a permanent solution to the PSH, the public stockholding issue. And generally, they want to see effective special and differential treatment, which will recognize their vulnerable situation. As far as net food importing countries, most African countries, LDCs are net food importing countries, small island states. And the WTO, we do have a dedicated decision on that, which is basically to ensure that they do not suffer disproportionately from increases in food prices. So we do have a decision which obviously I think a number of members have said that it should be fully operationalized. So we do have that. But I think as Eugenio mentioned, I think we need to see how we can basically revamp the agreement on agriculture. Obviously, I think all countries have a role to play. And I think one of the difficulties we have had is that countries want others to do something and they themselves don't want to do anything. And if we were to do that, then it will be very difficult. We will not be able to get out of this hole. So if we really want to revamp the agreement on agriculture to ensure that it makes a positive contribution, then all countries would have to compromise. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. Already the negotiations started in 2000, and we are in 2020, and we haven't made significant progress apart from export competition. Now, let me turn to the Agriculture Symposium, which will be held on 2nd to 3rd December. And I think, as Doa said, it's very important. We are marking the 25th anniversary, and this is also to give prominence to the fact that agriculture is very key. What do we need to do to ensure that the agricultural sector is able, we have a growing world population by 2050, in the next few decades, global population is estimated to increase to about 9 to 10 billion. We need to have a dynamic sector. At the same time, we also need to be mindful of not using too many resources, whether fertilizers, water, everything. So we need to see how we can have sustainable agriculture. And I think that is part of the focus of this symposium. The UN Secretary General has called for a UN Food Systems Summit to be convened in 2021 to address all aspects of global food systems. And I hope that the WTO Symposium can help shape the narrative on trade as experts from across the globe discuss the contribution of trade to the food security, nutrition, environmental sustainability, food safety, and other issues. In an exciting session towards the end of the symposium, we will be hearing firsthand from farmers themselves, their experience with 20 years, 25 years of the agreement on agriculture. So please tune in for the symposium. I think already this has been a very good, we have seen how we need to approach reform in agriculture. And I think we would hear more at the symposium. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you, Dora.
Thank you very much, everyone. We have an avalanche of questions from viewers and very little time. So I will be directing some questions to you, but asking you to please not take more than a minute or a minute and a half to answer so we can get to everyone's question. Eugenio, I will start with you. As the representative of IFPRI on this webinar, we have a question to you as to whether in the past 25 years, the biggest dips in agricultural trade have had to do with the food price crisis of 2008 and now COVID. Were those the two biggest drops that we've seen?
It depends if you measure in value or in volume. In 2008, there was a spike. So the volume of agricultural trading value was increasing. Then it dipped a little bit in 2009, and that kept on increasing. Now I would say, so this was a completely different thing. The other was excess of demand, if you want, in the macroeconomic cycle that led to high prices, and then there was all this panic. But then now we have a demand shock because of labor constraints, social distancing, etc., that still is not necessarily had been reflected in the supply shock on the supply side. So this year it's not going to be a problem. I think, as I mentioned before, our model suggests that we may be more careful next year, not that we are going to have a repeat of the price increases, because there may be some supply constraints, but at the same time, demand will still be depressed. So it's going to be a different environment, 2008, 2009. But certainly the COVID in general is the biggest shock for the world economy, probably even bigger than the 30s. Hopefully it's going to be short-lived, but the consequences may be long affecting us.
Thank you. Ambassador Zulailwa, we have a question from a viewer about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Will that agreement help Africa with its agricultural trade and help the continent better integrate into the WTO system?
Thank you very much, Doa, and thank you for that question. Yes, definitely the AFCFTA will have a lot of benefits and advantages for African countries. And the way we're looking at it is not only from a trade point of view in terms of boosting intra-Africa trade, including in agriculture, but it's also being used to spur broader sustainable development. And in this regard, we're looking at also using the AFCFTA to spur industrial development, because as I said, if we look at the fact that we are importing over 80% of our food needs elsewhere, industrial development is a priority. And in this regard, there is a discussion around the development of regional value chains. And the agricultural sector has been identified as a priority for that purpose. And once we get the regional value chains right, we'll be able to move up the value chain and integrate better into the global trade. Of course, the work of the WTO is going to be critical in addressing all the challenges that we identified in the previous session, including the issues of tariff escalations that Adwini spoke about. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Sunanta, a viewer was intrigued by your comment on export restrictions and the need for that to be a priority issue in future negotiations in the WTO, preventing those restrictions from harming food importing countries. They're in particular asking about rice, which is one of Thailand's main exports and which tends to be a culprit every time there's a crisis. What can you tell us about rice in particular?
Oh, well, I think that for Thailand, we just only have the TRQ on rice. So it's, what can I say? What I can say is that we don't have the restriction on rice per se. But obviously for the SPS, I think that we have some, but that is normal. But I still don't see any problem of the rice trade for Thailand and also the importation. But then I'm not quite sure about the question, whether it's regarding Thailand or in general.
In general.
Okay, if it's in general, I think that for Thailand, our main importers always be some kind of the neighboring country, like in ASEAN, and also in some neighboring country in Asia. So we don't see pretty much the restriction on that particular sense on rice. So I think that for us, it seems that we have to compete in the term of price. That is normal. But in the term of trade restriction to our export on rice, I don't see any major problem on that.
Thank you very much. To both Bob and Ed Dwini, a viewer has sent the same question. Given what you've both described as being a very changed landscape of agricultural trade over the past 25 years, different players, different products, different volume of trade, what are the implications of that for how the WTO negotiates? Do you think the WTO needs to negotiate differently given these changes? Bob, let me start with you.
Thanks, Doa. Well, this is, I guess, a bit of a pet peeve for me. One of the things that I think needs to happen differently is that negotiators need to be thinking about the future evolution or potential evolutions of the global economy. What we've observed in the last 25 years is significant changes, geopolitical changes, technological changes, particularly in productivity and technique. Those kinds of changes, by the way, are continuing. We heard about African integration. I think that's going to be a very, very important and potentially big player in global ag production, but also climate change, which will have implications for production technique, but also in terms of where different products can be produced. So if negotiators are going to think about an agreement, they ought to be thinking about flexibility in coming back and not be stuck in this, we can't negotiate or update the agreement until we can agree on almost everything. I think it's important that they take pieces of it and try to address those pieces and adapt over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Edwini, over to you.
Thank you, Doa. I think it's a very, very relevant question. And I think it's not only applicable to agriculture, but as well, other areas as well. I think WTO members are currently, mulling over WTO reform. And part of the WTO reform is how do we negotiate? Like I mentioned, the agricultural negotiations started in 2000 and we are in 2020. So the question is the mandate still valid? Do we need to look at, contemporary issues? And I think all of these are valid. I think Eugenio made a very, very good point. But it's quite clear that, we need to have rules which are able to, we need to have increased production. We need to have flexibility for countries. But then how do we balance these? Obviously, if countries don't want to contribute themselves, then it will be very difficult. And I think those days are over. All countries have to contribute. Without that, it will be impossible. But if every country says we want to have policy space and others, then it will not work. So I think we need to move away from that and see how we can have a mutually beneficial agreement, an agreement which will be realistic, an agreement which will be fair, because obviously currently we have imbalances. And how do we move away from the imbalances to ensure that we have a fair agreement which will be responsive to contemporary challenges? And I think the members are capable of doing that, but they all need to be very flexible and see the bigger picture. It is true that we may need to, move away from what we have been negotiating, look at other issues. And although I think we do have a very good framework which we can build on, but I think it will require members to be more imaginative and be more open to trading concessions. Otherwise, I think we'll be stuck in a hole. And even if we come with an agreement, that agreement may be short-lived in terms of enabling members to deal with the challenges that they face or they may face in the near future. Climate change is one of them. So we do have a lot of issues, and I think members are capable of, transcending that, but it will require deeper thinking. And I think the symposium that we having would throw light on some of these issues and how we can really have the tools, how we can come up with an innovative agreement which will serve countries for the next 2-3 decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We only have 2 minutes left. There were a lot of questions from viewers on global value chains in particular. Bob, could I have you comment on global value chains in agriculture and how they will be integral to the future of ag trade?
Thanks, Doa. So I think a key element here is recognizing that in global value chains, typically production is the result of an interaction between the different sectors. So the ag food sector depends on manufacturing and services. Much of the service sector depends on the food economy. So these things are all very, very related. one long time challenge, I think, for the agricultural sector is that much of the value in the agri-food sector goes on the food side, right? So you talk about moving up the value chain. That's a very difficult thing for farmers to be able to do. They tend to be very good at production. They have to know a lot in order to be able to produce, and they may not know very much about changing consumer preferences or the whole process of getting products to the final consumer. And that's always been a challenge. That was a challenge back in the early 1980s when I started in agriculture. Complaints by U.S. farmers that cereal and bread bakers got far more value than the production of their wheat on the farm. Farmers, I think, have to find a way to deal with that. Sometimes cooperatives can help, but it's going to be a challenge. I think they're critical in terms of input supply, technological advancement, and adapting to changing circumstances. Value chains are going to be very, very important. But thinking about how you divvy up the pie among the various players, that's a long-term problem that I've not seen any easy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. And I would like to thank our panel profusely for making the time for this session. And I'd like to thank everybody who works behind the scenes to make these trade dialogues happen. Let me just close by reminding our viewers that the Agriculture Symposium will take place from 2 to 3 December. It's a virtual symposium. If you go to your browser and you type WTO Agriculture Symposium 2020, our webpage will come up. The symposium will be live streamed on the WTO YouTube channel. You only need to register if you'd like to be part of the live Q&A. We very much look forward to seeing you in December. Goodbye, everyone.